Okay, so welcome everybody. This afternoon, we are going to spend some time looking at rubrics and how to create rubrics and what that means for helping promote meaningful assessment. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm pretty sure everyone in the room does know me. My name is Dr. Kimberley Davis. I am the assessment and feedback guru for academic and digital development. Also to say that this session is for you, so feel free to ask questions, to interrupt, to share your own experiences if you have experience with rubric creation. I want you to feel like you are getting the most out of this. And also don't be afraid if I start to lapse into acronyms, because our department loves a good acronym. If you don't know what the acronym is, please feel free to ask. If I forget that not everybody on this side of the Atlantic likes baseball, and I lapse into baseball metaphors to explain things, and you really have no idea what I'm talking about, feel free to just nudge me and say, Kim, is hitting a home run a good thing or a bad thing? I try not to do that as much as possible, but sometimes I get excited and I forget. So if there's anything that you're kind of like, what? Feel free to just nudge me. You can pop it into the chat. You can unmute yourself and shout at me. However that might work for you. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a handy dandy PowerPoint. Let me bring that up. So I lovingly call this rubrics to the rescue, because I strongly believe that a good rubric can help you in your assessment procedures. But what I want to do, I kind of want to start with, what is your opinion? What are your thoughts on rubrics? So do you like them? Do you hate them? Do they scare you? How are you feeling at this point in time about rubrics?
So can I ask a really silly question? What bit are you calling the rubric? Because we use that to mean like the wording of the essay title or the assignment requirements. That's how that's used within the program where I do most of my teaching. But I'm thinking that's not what we're talking about here.
So what we are talking, so this is excellent, because one of the things that becomes very important too when we're discussing things is how we define these terms. And this is also something to think about when we are sharing these things with our students. How do we define these? How do we make sure that what we say matches what they're expecting to see? So in this case, when we talk about rubrics here today, what I want us to think about is the set of criteria that we are using to mark the assignments. So this can include the assignment brief, this includes your intended learning outcomes, and this includes the criteria that you are going to design that's going to help you as you move through to determine whether or not a student has been successful with the assessment task. This also gives them a set of expectations. So creating this type of rubric, showing them to your students so that they know what constitutes, a good, what's going to help them earn a good mark, what's going to not get them where they need to be, can help set the expectations for the assessment. So you can focus then on the important bit, which is that demonstration of knowledge. So those of you who've spent any time with me know that I view assessment as the tool in which students demonstrate that they've done everything you've asked of them in the intended learning outcomes. So that's their chance to show off. And what the rubric is going to do is give them the expectations for what a good demonstration of knowledge will look like. It will help them understand where the mark has come from. you don't just pull grades out of the sky, yet sometimes our students feel like they come from, we sit through, we read their assignment, we think, oh yeah, that's a B2, and then we move on. So this helps kind of show them what goes into the mark, how that comes about, which means then that you can focus on you can focus the feedback on important things like what they've done well, what they can improve on for next time, how it links then to other assignments or other skills. And your feedback becomes less about grade justification, because your students know the criteria and they know where you have, what you've been looking for when you're assessing, and what areas you have focused on. So that's an excellent question. And so, yeah, for this, my long-winded answer is the rubric will be the set of criteria to which you are going to mark an assignment. So who loves rubrics? Am I the only one? Okay, I see. I get at least one who loves them. Some who are like, meh, yeah. Anyone who just completely does not like them? No, okay, that's good.
I like them, but I wouldn't say I love them.
Okay, you tolerate them. You're on the neutral side. You're on the neutral side of the Likert scale. I can appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, if 5 is absolutely, yeah, love, I'm probably a 4, yeah.
Okay, so I think that's good. Is there anything that any of you really don't like about rubrics?
I think when I've done it in the past, it can feel like the thought of creating one from scratch can feel like a big job. I know it's worth it. I know it's worth it for me. I know it's worth for colleagues. I know it's worth it for the students. But I think this is why it's quite interesting, because you and I talk about assessment and rubrics, but actually, when we were having a discussion before, a few weeks ago, before I signed up for this session, I was saying, do you know what, I haven't really reflected on this for a while. And so I'm trying to kind of look at it in a fresh way. And I think it can feel a bit daunting, actually.
Yeah. Rachel, were you going to
add? Excuse me, sorry, I've got a bad cough. Yeah, so I guess I've almost got a bit of a funny view, because I've never had to create one. So I'm currently in my first teaching position as a maternity cover, and I would have actually found them quite useful coming into things for helping me kind of get used to marking. Yeah. Whereas we kind of have we have a rubric in terms of this is what you're looking for in each section, but not like ones that I've used before, which were like, okay, if this is what it says in this section, this is the grade. This is what it says, this is the grade. So I've used kind of different forms of them, but I do think more detailed ones are quite useful for kind of someone who's new to it. But obviously that's more work for the original members of staff as well.
Yeah, the thing I will say about that, though, and we'll talk about it as we kind of move on through, ways of thinking about it, is yes, it's a lot of work up front, and I think this is part of what Amanda was saying too. Yes, you do have to sit down with it, and it's going to take some time to create. But then once it's created, you're good. Then it's about maintenance. Then it's about retooling if an assignment changes. Then you've got a template as well that you can use for other courses, or if the assessment changes but the skills are kind of the same. So I do think that is really, it's a really helpful tool when you've inherited a course and an assessment, or you're doing a cover, or some of you will work on programs where GTAs are part of the assessment team and they're not actually involved in the creation of the assessment. So to then make sure that they know how to fairly mark and consistently mark across an assessment team as well. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, we don't work with GTAs, but we work with associate tutors, and they have commented quite often that they find these helpful. and we feel as a team that it makes our moderation much more consistent. That said, I do find some drawbacks when I'm looking at them. Sometimes I still find that I'm using a lot of subjective terminology, like, you know, still because I'm trying to use some of the Schedule A wording to show alignment.
Yeah.
I'm using things like, it was excellent. It was, or even, you know, what is a consistent response or a coherent response or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you try to pin down, sometimes I'm looking for so many examples of something. I do worry that we actually end up saying there's one way to do this assignment and it's this way. And that actually is not, that discourages creative thinking.
Yes. So that
so-
is perfect. Yeah. That is the balance that you want to try and find with this. And we'll talk about that too, is you don't want it to be so vague that you leave them with like, well, what does excellent look like? What does that mean? What is coherent? What is this? But you don't want to make it so specific that you then have the kind of, we used to have this thing in the US, and I don't know if it was a thing here, called Mad Libs. And basically it was a written paragraph and it just took some words out and it would tell you pop in an adjective, pop in a noun here. So you basically had a template and all the responses were basically the same, but, you know, maybe the adjectives and nouns used were a little bit different. And we don't want that, because as you said, that kind of stifles the creativity of that demonstration of knowledge. But we do also want them to come away feeling like they understand what the expectations are, feeling like they understand kind of what that looks like. So that's really excellent. And I think these are all really good thoughts moving forward. So really, this is kind of what we've already said. You know, we need it to be coherent. So we want it to be something that the students understand. We want it to, you know, discuss performance quality or assessment criteria. And we want it to be something that the students can use while they are completing their assignment, to make sure that they're, you know, meeting these expectations, and that we are using the rubrics when we are assessing the students, so that we are having that level of consistency across marking in case there's a marking team, or even just the way that we mark each assignment. It is done so in a very fair and equitable fashion, right? It's against a set of criteria and it's not against you know, another student's work, because the university does not want you to do that. So that's called norm-based referencing. And that's where, you know, I read Amanda's work and it is an A1 and I'm like, great, I found this. And then I read Rachel's and I think, well, is it as good as Amanda's? Yeah, but not quite. Okay, so this is going to be in the A range still, but it's not going to be an A1. Okay, she's going to get an A4. And then I'm going to read Elizabeth's. And does Elizabeth stack up to Amanda's, which is like the A1? No, not quite. Okay, is it as good, you know, as Rachel's? You know, what's kind of happening in here? Yeah, okay. And then you do it that way. So don't do that. The university doesn't want you to do that. Rather to have this set of criteria. So then I want you to think about how that then helps the student with their learning, and what this rubric can do to help kind of focus them, and help them have a better understanding of, you know, what they actually need to take away from our course, what they need to do to demonstrate that knowledge in an assessment and an assessment task. So there are some different types of ways we can think about assessment. There's different types of skills. There is process, so a process, and this is, you know, things like if you're working in the med school or vet school, and you're doing an OSCE type where the students have to walk you through a procedure, or explain and kind of work through what they would do. And you're looking at, have they met that, you know, can they take a patient history in an accurate manner? Have they covered all these things? So that's one way to look at that. And then you've got products. So some of you will be working with things like essays or reports, or, you know, other types of academic work that, you know, involves the creation of something, and it's that creation that is being evaluated. So thinking about that, you know, can also help determine what type of rubric you need, what types of skills are going to then be important in terms of assessment. So if you're, you know, if you are evaluating your students on oral communication, that's obviously going to be very different than how well they can write something, how well they can walk you through a process, how well they can do those steps is obviously very different than, can they put an essay together? Can they make, you know, can they make a concept map around something? So thinking about this is very important. You know, kind of knowing where you sit in the type of performance that's being assessed. Is it a process? Is it a product? Because understanding kind of where you sit in that camp means the type of rubric that then is going to be most helpful for you to create. And there are two different types of rubrics. Well, there's a lot, but there's two that I think are most important and would kind of fit what everybody across the university is doing. And one is a holistic rubric. So that is where you've got kind of a rating scale, and you're looking at, you know, the kind of big picture. How well have they done, you know, a series of things, and how well has it kind of fit together to create one product? And you're usually working on a kind of sliding scale. So is it weak? Is it satisfactory? Is it strong? You might have, you know, kind of 4 to 5 ratings within that is kind of the norm for this. Or there is an analytic rubric, and this has that kind of same rating scale. But what it does is it looks at each criterion separately. So how well they have met criterion 1, how well they've met criterion 2, how well they've met criterion 3. And it looks at each of them and rates each of them separately. So you're almost looking at the assessment in bits, rather than, you know, kind of as a whole. And when you are thinking about whether or not a holistic rubric or an analytic rubric is going to be right for you, the first thing to do is think about the, you know, is it a process? Is it a product? A process tends to lend itself a bit better to a holistic rubric, depending on the skills that you're looking at. That can determine what type of rubric is going to fit best as well. So the next thing that I would say is really important is then defining that criteria. So what is it that you want your students to be able to demonstrate in the assessment that is going to show that they have met the skills outlined in the intended learning outcomes? And what does that look like? What are the important things that they need to show you that will, you know, demonstrate that knowledge, that will, you know, make sure that they are successful moving forward? And that's going to be, you know, something really important to think about. And within that, you know, 6 to 7 criteria. You don't want to have too many, but if that seems like a lot, you may not have that many. It depends on the type of assignment. It depends on how complex it is. It depends on where it falls within the semester. And this can be really helpful in terms of how you look at what needs to be done, and, you know, how you explain to the students what you're looking for. So I noticed Amanda's question in the chat, and I think this is really important. think what I would say is the rubrics across a program should be consistent, right? Our students are going to go through the program. They are the ones that are going through every course. And for them, it can get very difficult and confusing if how they're evaluated in one course for one set of skills is then evaluated completely different in another course. So if they're being evaluated and assessed on their writing skills in Sarah's course, and then they come to my course and I'm also evaluating them on their writing skills, but we're not using the same set of criteria, that can get very difficult for students. That can make it extremely hard for them to know what these expectations are and what they need to be doing. And I think that, and those of you who also know me know that I am a big advocate of a program focused approach. So I think you should be looking at it from the program level to make that consistency where it can happen. So obviously, you know, report writing and essay writing, yes, both writing, but different, and are going to have different expectations. So where the skills need to be aligned, having a rubric that is the same, or at least having a base of consistent expectations, is what's going to help the students really then be able to develop those skills and be able to really take them forward. Because what we want to see is that from year one to the final year, that they've grown and developed those skills, that they've become the experts. And yeah, it's very difficult. As Sarah's mentioned, it is very difficult to get, you know, the more people you have on a program team, the more challenging it is going to be to get everybody to agree to one set of standards. So this is difficult, but we will talk about how we can use the 22-point scale as kind of a base, and how we can use you know, that as kind of the jumping off point, because that is something that is the same across the entire university. Whether you're on Schedule A or Schedule B, that grading scale, the expectations, the grade descriptors for that are the same for everybody. And using that as the base, and then thinking about how you personalize that, how you make it fit within your context, is going to go a long way to help with that. What it also does as well is it helps with the comments that we get on NSS or on our EVASys feedback that say marking's not consistent, the marking's not the same, marking's not consistent, I don't get it, this person got this feedback, this person, you know, did this, how come this one said this and that one said that. So this can also help with some of those issues as well. So once you have thought about that and you have, you know, the set of criteria, you know, if you want an analytic rubric or a holistic rubric, then it's time to start thinking about, you know, what you want to do. Now, this process, I'd like to say I came up with this, but I didn't. This is from Brown University in the US, and I think it's a great way to start looking at it. So I've given you the link to their actual website, and you'll have a copy of the slides, but I think they've done an excellent job of kind of putting together how to think about these types of rubrics and what this looks like. So the next thing that I want you to do is to ask yourself some questions. And I've given you these questions. So what exactly is the assigned task? What are the students being asked to do? For the course that I teach on, my students are asked to create 2 assessment briefs that have a formative assessment and a feedback strategy. So that's what it is. And what I want to do is I am then looking it in separate tasks. So what are the assessments they've created? What does the feedback strategy look like? I've set out how these kind of individual components that I'm looking for fit together to make that larger picture of the assessment. The other thing to think about, and those of you who've gone through PG CAP will know we talk about this a lot, is constructive alignment. So how do the learning outcomes, how are those learning outcomes demonstrated by the assessment? How do they fit together? And that can also help you determine your characteristics for what you need to be looking at. So if you have a learning outcome that says students will be able to design, a set of code that can be used in, an app, then your assessment obviously needs to be them creating a code that can be used in an app. And your criteria then is going to be related to that. How, does the code work? How well does it link to the app? How user friendly is it? So you want those things to all be tied together. The other thing to think about then is what is that good, what's going to be that stellar example? What would a good piece of work look like? Because if you can think about what you expect for a good piece of work, then you can then set out your criteria. And this is where you can then find that balance between being too specific or too vague. So if you want to use the language that is, set out in the 22-point scale definitions, and I know the A band says, excellent attainment, then you can then define what the excellent attainment is going to be. So you can say, an excellent piece of work will have these things. And that's where you can really start to think about how then to explain those expectations to the students and how that then sets out what you write in your rubric. And then you want to think about the type of feedback that you think is going to be the most helpful to your students. So what type of feedback do you want to give them? Does it have to be grade related? You can create rubrics, big, really strong rubrics for formative tasks, because providing them feedback based on a rubric with that can then help clarify the things they'll need to do for a summative task. Do you want it to be, is it 80% looks at this and 20% looks at this type of skill? So are the grades different? Is there going to be more than one grade? How detailed do you want that? So how detailed do you want the feedback to be? Because that can also determine how detailed your criteria are. So if you have a very detailed set of criteria, then the feedback that you provide doesn't necessarily need to be as detailed. You can point them back to the rubric and the criteria, and then you can give them the feed forward aspect that says, you've done this really well, do this again. Or in this section, you'll see the criteria says this, you need to make sure you're paying attention to that. So that can help really think about that kind of feed forward aspect and how you utilize feedback for learning. So how you make sure that the time and effort that you're putting into providing the feedback is going to be useful to the students and something that they know how to use, instead of just saying, oh, well, I got the mark, cool, and then just, chuck it. So that can be, a really important way to kind of think about that. So thinking about those questions when you sit down to create your rubric can make the process a bit easier. It's not going to take any less time. It's still going to be time intensive, unfortunately, sorry. But it can make that process a bit easier because it can offer you a really good guide of how you want to move forward with it. Any questions about this so far? No. Okay, good. So I thought we'd start with looking at an analytic rubric. And this is where you are thinking about the skills and abilities that students need to demonstrate, how they show these outcomes. Each of the criterion then should focus on a different skill or outcome. And it should be, kind of a brief statement of, here's the criterion, here's what I'm looking for. And it should be measurable. So this is the really important thing. You want to make sure in an analytic rubric that everything is measurable. You don't want it. So that's why saying things like, excellent attainment, how do you measure that? What does that mean? That's not really something you can kind of quantify and measure. So an analytic rubric shouldn't have a criteria that says, something like that. So you want to make sure it's measurable, and you want to make sure that this is something that, is very clear for the students. So, concise, but clear. And this would be set up kind of in the left-hand side of your rubric. This is kind of where it all starts. These are the things I'm looking for. And this is where you can have maybe 6 to 7, I would say no more than 6 to 7 criteria. Some of you won't need that many. Some of you might find you need more depending on what the rubric is for. So a rubric for, something that's a 60 credit course, right? If you've got them doing a final year project or assignment, if they're working on a dissertation, those things obviously have more components and will have more criteria. So that's okay. But in a standard assessment, no more than 6 to 7. The other thing then you want to think about is what that level of achievement looks like. And this is where having that example of what the perfect response would be becomes important. So understanding that, this can be like a numerical, kind of the 1 to 5, with 5 being the best, 1 being they haven't covered it. I would say a kind of short description, though, with a category is probably easier for students to identify with. So I've given you some examples of, what those kind of look like, descriptions that have been used. This is what would be kind of at the top of your rubric. And you kind of have boxes for those, so you can kind of check off or put some feedback in with whichever box the student has fallen under for each criteria. And this is something to consider when you're thinking about this. Some other things to consider are the year, right? So the level of your students, and what skills they should already have, what skills are covered in the ILOs, how complex you can get with those. So how much time have they had with these skills? How is this built upon previous work? How will it build on future work? And those types of things can help to decide, what kind of descriptions you use. So if it's definitely something that they'll see again, something like the beginning, developing, competent, that type of language might be more appropriate. If you were working in things where it's kind of a big overall checklist of skills, I'm thinking medical school, dental school, vet school, where you're, some of the more practical based programs, things like improvement, satisfactory, good, accomplished. That kind of mirrors the language that they will see on professional examinations. So if you do have outside governing bodies, matching to some of those, to some of that language as well, can be helpful for the students, so that they are seeing it and have practice with it with us, and then take that forward when they do their big exams. So that's kind of what would come from an analytic rubric. I think that's kind of a good way to think about it, and think about, how you create the criterion, what that's going to look like, what skills are important. If we think about the holistic rubric, this is, across a whole performance. So this is, an entire piece of work that's being judged as a whole. You're not breaking it down into like specific smaller tasks or specific components. these tend to be quicker to create, but the type of feedback provided and the kind of analysis that you do of their work, this is where it tends to be a bit more vague. So in analytic rubric, you're very specific about what you're looking for. You're very specific about the criteria. Where in holistic rubrics, you're not as specific because you're looking at a whole piece of work as one thing. So this also is where that question about what type of feedback is going to be important can help then determine what type of rubric is going to be most appropriate. So thinking about this, you're still thinking about skills and abilities that the students need. You're still looking at kind of the appropriate level of accomplishment. So how well have they mastered these skills that you've set out? But what this does is it looks at it as a big picture. So a successful assignment that has met all of the ILOs would look like this, rather than a successful attainment of this criteria looks like this. The successful attainment of the next criteria looks like this. So this is just the whole thing. This is the whole puzzle, rather than how well each puzzle piece is made to make the bigger picture. Does that make sense? Okay. What we tend to see, I think it's a bit more common to see holistic rubrics across campus because they are a bit easier to create, and because depending on, you know, the skills and the way the assessment is designed, it just lends itself to be a bit easier to create. But I think both are good. So I don't think there's a right or wrong. It is definitely the skill set that you find important, and, you know, how you want to provide feedback for the students that I think should be the determinant of what type of rubric. And you may find you use a little bit of both. Depending on the assignment, if you're doing, you know, 2 assessments in your course, you may have you know, a holistic rubric for one and an analytic for another. There isn't a set kind of, if you pick one lane, you have to stay in it, not at all. So don't feel like you have to be locked into that. There's also other ways you can create rubrics. You may find that kind of combining elements of both are going to work better. You may find that you want to just, you know, tackle it on your own without thinking about this kind of structure. And that's okay too. The more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become with it, and you'll find what works and what doesn't for you. So don't think you have to be locked into just one. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, so I want to switch, I want to kind of switch topics now for a minute to think about what can be a good starting point for creating the rubric. So now that you know some tips about how to start creating, you know, how to create the rubrics, thinking about where to start can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming. If you're trying to make sure that there is some consistency, utilizing the 22-point scale is going to help as a baseline for that consistency, because what it does is, this is for everybody across the university, right? Everybody uses the 22-point scale. They either use Schedule A or Schedule B, but everybody uses this. So starting that as the base for how the language can be structured around either the creation of your criteria, or, you know, how you structure the language around a holistic rubric, this is where you can start, because the 22-point scale has descriptors of what this looks like. Yeah, so the student guide, Elizabeth, you're right, the student guide is really, really helpful, and making that available to the students and kind of signposting it to them as well means that they can have a, you know, a really good understanding of what that looks like and kind of why we do this. We also have to think that, you know, our students are international. For some of them, this is the very first time they have studied in the UK, or this is their first time studying at the University of Glasgow. And the 22-point scale is not used in other places. I know when I first started here, I was like, wow, that's big, that's a lot. Because I was not used to it. And when I moved here from the US 10 years ago, we used a very different marking scheme from even what's done at other universities in the UK. So showing our students this, kind of talking them through it, showing how our language and our rubrics connects to this, can help them get familiar with it, can help them see that consistency. So what you'll see is for each grade band, there is a description of, kind of what would meet that grade band. But if you look at it, it also is pretty vague. And that is intentional, because obviously we don't want everybody locked into one answer, to one type of thing. But when you're creating your rubrics, you don't want to be this vague, because this still leaves a lot of questions, right? Okay, exemplary range and depth of attainment. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean they know that there was an intended learning outcome? Or does that mean that they've answered it perfectly? So there would still be things you need to clarify, but again, this can act as a very good base. So here's where we start. Now, what do I want that to look like? So if I said this, this is an A and it's going to be, this vague description, how do I then make that specific to either my assignment as a whole or each set of criteria? What would that look like? So I've given you this, I've given you, again, the breakdown so you can see it, but it's also available. I've given you a link to the assessment handbook where it is, and it breaks down a bit better. But this is a good base. This is a good place to start to consider how you might want to think about the language, how you might say this. So you might say exemplary, range and depth of attainment, but you might then be more specific about what that then looks like. So you're mirroring that language, but then you are adding that specificity for your assignment or for, that criteria. And that, I think, is one way to then start thinking about how we make it consistent across a program. But that also means that the program team has to be on board with that as a starting point, has to be on board with what you're looking at for different skills, where the skills overlap. And that's part of a larger conversation that you can't solve at this point in time. And it may have to go on the in a perfect world list, at least for a little while longer. But it's definitely something to consider using that, because then too, you are linking it back to the university. So when a student says, well, why are you asking me to do that? You can say, University Handbook, Code of Assessment, which is part of the student contract, gets sent out as part of the student contract. They all get it when they accept an offer to the university and say, here's the rules, it's in the rules. You got an email with the rules. Remember that contract you signed? And that can help, make those connections. It can help potentially make some of those difficult conversations a little less difficult. Just reminding them that it was in their student contract goes a long way. Sometimes they're not even aware that they have legally signed a document that includes all of that, which is a little bit frightening, but a gentle reminder can point them back in that direction. And what it does is it just leaves little wiggle room or doubt. It allows you to, in case someone comes to you and disputes their grade, to be able to go through and show how you created it, how it relates to what the university expectations are as well. So it can save you some potential hassle in that way as well. So then your rubrics, how does this then support your assessments? How does a rubric support meaningful assessment? And what I will say to this is, this then allows you to relate your feedback to real world tasks. It allows you to make the connections between the skills they are learning and how they will use it moving forward. You spend less time on that grade justification, and more time then on the skills that are important. So this becomes more about, skills, how to improve performance, how to move forward, highlighting what they've done well, because sometimes our students don't know they've done something well. So part of that feedback and part of that rubric as well is highlighting what they've done right. Because sometimes it's a happy accident, right? They've done something really well and they're not aware of it, or they guessed that that's how it should be. So also then taking the time to point that out, it means you can focus your feedback on things like that and on making those connections. And it allows you to be very clear about it, because you've got that set of criteria, because you've got a rubric that says, here are the things we were looking for, here's the skills that are important, here's how you demonstrate your learning. Then you can then focus your feedback, focus your comments on how well they've done that, or where they need to, think about it in greater depth. And the thing about this too is, when you have a rubric, giving it to the students before you do the marking, so that they have it the whole time. You just attach it to the assessment brief, so they have it the whole time. This can help them set up their assignments as strong as possible from the outset. They have no reason to not know what the expectations are, because not only do you have an assessment brief that you discuss in class, but you have a rubric that shows what you are looking for and what would be, what makes an excellent example, what kind of hits in the middle, and what wouldn't be a good example. So there's no reason for them to not know what to expect. And it allows them then to focus on that demonstration of knowledge. So it allows them to then be like, yeah, look at how cool I am. I've learned all these things, and I'm going to show you that now. It then, as we've talked about, it allows you to really provide that informative feedback. It allows you to focus. And it also, again, as we've said, it promotes that kind of higher level learning, because now you can say you've mastered this, or you need to focus on that. And it inspires that equality and accessibility. So it means that our students aren't struggling to complete our assessments for the wrong reasons, right? We're starting them off on as equal a playing field as we can. They all have the same set of expectations. They're all being marked the same way with the same set of criteria. And there's none of this thing that they think we do, where we just read a sentence and then pluck a grade out of our brain and out of thin air. And all of these things can then help with consistency in marking teams, but it also can do a lot to bolster the confidence of our students. So they know they're not being marked against the person sitting next to them. They know that, you're reading theirs as an individual piece of work and not as part of the collective and how well it's done in the collective. And it also helps because unless you are marking assignments where, 2 + 2 = 4, right? That's all the answer's ever going to be. It allows you to be as objective as you can with subjective answers. So there's always going to be a bit of subjectivity in our marking. There's always going to be a bit of that where you don't have, one right answer. But what the rubrics can do is help kind of minimize that as much as possible. So when you have that assessment team, when you have a team of markers, if a little subjectivity is in there, that's fine, but it's not going to change the consistency of marking across the whole team. So those are, I think, are really important in terms of how it supports assessment, how it supports meaningful assessment tasks, which are then geared to making those connections to real world, real world learning and what they'll be doing when they leave us, because it's focused on the skills. It's focused rather than just on the assignment itself. So if you take nothing away from today, or I've now, overloaded you with information, what I would like you to think about is, when you're creating your rubric, what is it you want your students to be able to demonstrate through the assessment or the assignment that they're doing? How can you link your assessment criteria, your ILOs together using the 22-point scale as the base? And when you are putting together your rubric, you want your students to be able to understand that rubric and understand how they're being assessed. So make sure you keep it simple, make sure you're as concise as possible, and you have a layout and a structure that is easy to read. And you want your students to be able to see how the ILOs are fit within the assessment, how they're actually demonstrating what you've told them at the outset they'll be able to do by the end of the course. And where possible, get your students' input. Create a rubric, send it to past students or current students, and get their perspective, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that are completing the assessment, and they're the ones that are then going to look at this to try and understand it to complete the assessment. So getting their feedback, asking them bits that are unclear or what they think about this, they'll tell you whether it's unclear, jargon. If there's words they don't know, they'll be quick to tell you, well, I don't know what that means, so how do I know how to do it? So if possible, getting their input and getting them involved in that, can be very beneficial. And as Sarah has said, colleagues, anyone who's created a rubric, can be of help. And anyone that you can look at past rubrics that you have as a starting point. And, Rachel, you've come into a new role, so you might then look at the rubric you have and be like, I don't know how to make this work. I don't know. And that might spur you on to create a rubric that even you can better understand. So it then makes it easier for you to mark. So there's all kinds of things you can do with that. You can always also come to me. I am happy to look over rubrics. You'll have a college contact from academic and digital development. You can always reach out to them as well and say, I've created, this rubric. Do you mind answering some questions? They will be happy to have a chat with you, or they'll send you to me and I'm happy to have a chat with you. So there's lots of ways you can also get help with this as well. So it doesn't have to be done in isolation. And there is always a friendly face around to help should you have questions about it. And with that, you have survived. You have survived your hour with me. So I know we're right at the hour, and I think we were only scheduled for an hour. So if you need to leave, feel free, but I'll hang out for another minute or so in case anybody has any questions. Sarah's put she put a link into the chat as well, where you can find your college contact if you don't know who it is already. And I just wanted to say thank you. You were all fantastic and wonderfully engaged, and hopefully you now feel a little bit better about rubrics. Amanda, I'm going to get you to love them and not just tolerate them, but that's probably a task for a different day. But slowly, I'm just going to work on you.
That's more than I realized.
We can both work on her together, Kim, because you know me, I love rubrics.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say thank you so much. Again, thanks for being flexible about the change in dates. Thanks for being interested and attentive. And with that, if you have no questions, I will see you around maybe for another, I'm doing a couple more of these sessions. And if not, maybe one day actually on campus in person. So thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your day. And it was my pleasure to talk you through rubrics today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.